Imagine watching your father being dragged onto a stage in front of hundreds of government officials. You see him trembling, tears streaming down his face as he reads from a prepared list. Each name he speaks condemns another man to death, including some of his closest friends. Armed guards escort the condemned from the auditorium one by one, while the remaining officials erupt in hysterical applause, terrified that any hesitation might mark them for execution too. At the podium stands Saddam Hussein, calmly smoking a cigar, occasionally wiping away theatrical tears as he orchestrates this masterpiece of political terror. Within hours, 68 men will be taken to execution grounds, where some will be forced to shoot their own colleagues, binding them through murder to the new dictator. This was not ancient history. This happened on July 22nd, 1979, and it was just the beginning of a reign of terror, so systematic, so calculated, and so utterly brutal that it would transform an entire nation into a landscape of nightmares. What Saddam Hussein did to Iraq over nearly 25 years goes beyond conventional tyranny into realms of cruelty that challenge comprehension. This is the story of a man who gassed entire towns of civilians, who built torture chambers where children were mutilated in front of their parents, who drained ancient marshlands to commit ethnic cleansing, whose sons murdered and raped with absolute impunity, and who left behind mass graves containing hundreds of thousands of bodies. If you think you understand evil, if you believe you know the depths of human cruelty, you are not prepared for what I am about to tell you. This is documented history, recorded in court proceedings, testified to by survivors, photographed in mass graves that are still being excavated today. This is the true story of Saddam Hussein, and I need you to stay until the end, because what he did to the Kurdish town of Halabja will change how you understand modern warfare forever. Before Saddam became the monster who terrorized Iraq, he was a child born into poverty and violence in 1937 in a small village near Tikrit. His father died before his birth, and his stepfather was brutal, dismissive, treating young Saddam with contempt that planted seeds of rage and ambition that would eventually consume an entire nation. This early life of deprivation created the paranoid, ruthless man he would become, someone who understood from childhood that power was everything and that those without it were crushed. By his 20s, Saddam had joined the Ba'ath Party, a nationalist movement promising Arab unity and socialist progress. But for Saddam, ideology was always secondary to personal ambition. The party was simply his vehicle to power. In 1959, he participated in a botched assassination attempt against Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. When the plot collapsed, Saddam fled to Egypt, where he spent years in exile, studying law at Cairo University, but more importantly, learning the art of political manipulation and ruthless survival. These years shaped his understanding that power must be seized and held through any means necessary, that loyalty was purchased through fear and patronage, and that potential rivals must be eliminated before they became threats. When Saddam returned to Iraq after the Ba'ath Party seized power in 1963, he began his methodical climb up the political ladder. He was patient, cunning, building networks of loyalty based on tribal connections and systematic intimidation. By 1968, when the Ba'ath Party regained control of Iraq, Saddam was vice president under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, but everyone who mattered understood where real power resided. Saddam controlled the security apparatus, the feared Mukhabarat intelligence service that he transformed into an instrument of absolute terror. The Mukhabarat infiltrated every level of Iraqi society, creating a surveillance state where neighbors spied on neighbors, where children were encouraged to report their parents' conversations, where even casual criticisms could result in disappearance, into the network of prisons and torture facilities that Saddam was systematically constructing. The message was brutally clear. Loyalty was mandatory. Questioning was fatal. Silence was survival. The 1970s saw Iraq undergo significant transformation under Ba'athist rule. Saddam orchestrated the nationalization of Iraq's oil industry, channeling massive revenues into development projects. Schools and hospitals sprouted across the country. Literacy rates improved dramatically, especially among women. Iraq's economy boomed, and for a brief moment, it seemed the country might become a regional powerhouse. But beneath this veneer of progress lurked a darker reality that survivors would later describe in testimony that makes your blood run cold. Every advancement came at the cost of freedom. Every economic gain was shadowed by systematic political repression that was not merely harsh, but deliberately designed to break the human spirit. The regime's torture centers were not improvised dungeons, but professionally designed facilities where interrogators were trained in techniques perfected over years of practice. Victims who survived these places described horrors that still wake them screaming decades later. Electric shocks applied to genitals and other sensitive areas, suspension from ceilings by wrists or ankles for days until joints dislocated, being submerged in pools of sewage and held under until consciousness faded, having fingernails and toenails torn out with pliers, being burned with cigarettes, blowtorches, and heated metal rods, watching family members, including children, tortured before their eyes to extract confessions or information. Women prisoners faced systematic sexual violence as both interrogation method and means of destroying family honor, with some forced to watch as their daughters or sisters were assaulted. When Saddam finally seized absolute power in July 1979, he did not simply accept the resignation of the aging President al-Bakr and take his place. That would have been insufficient for someone who understood that power required not just position, but demonstration of dominance. What followed was one of the most chilling displays of political theater in modern history. The purge I described at the beginning that set the tone for everything that would follow. On July 22nd, Saddam convened an extraordinary session of Ba'ath Party leadership at a large auditorium. Hundreds of party officials gathered, unaware of the fate awaiting them. Saddam stood at the podium, theatrically smoking a cigar, projecting an image of calm control. He announced the discovery of a Syrian-backed conspiracy within the party, a fabricated plot that would justify what came next. Then he called forward a colleague named Muhi Abdul Hussein, who had been arrested and tortured until he agreed to cooperate. This broken man mechanically read out the names of alleged conspirators from a prepared list, his voice shaking, knowing that each name condemned a man to death. One by one, 68 officials were identified. As each name was called, armed guards entered and escorted the accused from the hall. Some protested their innocence, voices rising in panic. Others sat in stunned silence Unable to process what was happening, the remaining members erupted in applause, frantically clapping and shouting loyalty oaths, terrified that any hesitation might mark them as conspirators too. Saddam watched it all with theatrical emotion, occasionally weeping crocodile tears, creating an atmosphere of surreal horror where no one knew who would be called next, where everyone understood that their lives hung by threads of the dictator's whim. The entire session was videotaped, the footage later distributed to party members as a lesson in what happened to those who threatened Saddam's authority. The accused were taken away and executed, some shot immediately, others tortured first to extract information about additional conspirators who probably never existed. But here is where the cruelty reached new depths. Some of the remaining party members, those who had escaped being named, were given weapons and forced to participate in the firing squads that killed their colleagues and friends. They were made to pull triggers, to send bullets into the bodies of men they had worked alongside for years. This served multiple purposes. It bound them to Saddam through complicity in murder. It demonstrated that refusal was not an option, that orders would be obeyed, no matter how horrific. It broke something fundamental in these men, destroying their capacity for moral resistance. After the executions, some of those who had been forced to shoot their colleagues went home and wept. Others withdrew into silence. All understood that they were now complicit, that they had blood on their hands, that Saddam owned them completely. This massacre eliminated potential rivals and sent an unmistakable message throughout Iraq. Opposition meant death. Loyalty meant survival, but required willingness to commit any act, no matter how heinous. Everyone was expendable. No one was safe. But Saddam's ambitions extended far beyond Iraq's borders. He envisioned himself as the modern Saladin, who would unite the Arab world and restore Arab glory. This grandiose vision led Iraq into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. In September 1980, Saddam ordered the invasion of Iran, launching a war that would consume both nations for 8 devastating years. His motivations were multiple: to seize Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, to crush the Islamic revolutionary government that threatened to inspire Iraq's Shia majority, to establish Iraq as the dominant regional power, to prove himself as a military leader of historical significance. The Iran-Iraq War became a nightmare of modern warfare that combined World War I-style trench fighting with 20th century weapons of mass destruction. Human wave attacks where thousands of Iranian soldiers, many of them teenage volunteers, charged across minefields and through machine gun fire. Chemical weapons deployed routinely against enemy forces. Ballistic missiles targeting civilian populations in both countries. The war's toll was staggering: over 500,000 dead, millions more wounded or displaced, both economies shattered, an entire generation traumatized. Iraq received significant support from Western powers, particularly the United States, which viewed Iran's revolutionary government as the greater threat. American intelligence helped Iraqi forces target Iranian positions. Western companies provided the materials and technology that enabled Iraq to develop chemical weapons. The moral calculation was simple and cynical. Iraq was useful against Iran, so atrocities could be overlooked. Throughout the war, Saddam demonstrated a willingness to use any method, no matter how brutal or internationally condemned, to achieve victory. When conventional warfare proved insufficient, he authorized the widespread use of chemical weapons against Iranian forces. Mustard gas and nerve agents like tabun and sarin were deployed routinely, turning battlefields into scenes of unimaginable suffering that survivors describe with voices that still shake decades later. Soldiers died choking on their own fluids, their skin covered in chemical burns and blisters, their eyes burned blind, their nervous systems shutting down as nerve agents blocked the signals between brain and body. Some convulsed for hours before dying, others suffocated slowly as their lungs filled with fluid. The lucky ones died quickly. The international community largely remained silent about these war crimes, prioritizing geopolitical calculations over humanitarian concerns. This tacit acceptance of chemical warfare would embolden Saddam to even greater atrocities, atrocities that would shock even those who had grown accustomed to his brutality. While the war with Iran raged, Saddam's internal security apparatus continued its work with methodical efficiency. The regime maintained dozens of detention facilities across Iraq, each with its own specialty in inflicting suffering. Abu Ghraib prison became perhaps the most infamous, though it was far from the only center of horror. Political prisoners, suspected dissidents, and anyone who attracted the regime is suspicion could find themselves in these facilities, where interrogators employed techniques designed to break both body and spirit. Former prisoners who survived to testify described experiences that sound like descriptions of hell. They spoke of being hung from ceilings by their wrists for days until their shoulders dislocated and their hands turned black from lack of circulation. They described having electric cattle prods applied to genitals, tongues, and other sensitive areas, while interrogators asked questions they could not possibly answer. They recounted being forced to watch as their children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, were brought in and tortured before their eyes. The screams of their own sons and daughters used as leverage to extract confessions. Women described systematic sexual violence that destroyed not just their bodies, but their sense of self, designed to make them broken things rather than human beings. The regime's torturers were trained systematically at interrogation centers that operated according to established protocols of brutality. There were manuals that instructed on proper techniques. There were supervisors who evaluated performance and provided feedback on effectiveness. This was not random sadism, but calculated, bureaucratized cruelty designed to crush any spirit of resistance and create a population too terrified to oppose the regime. The torture was scientific in its precision, psychological in its understanding of how to break human beings, and industrial in its scale. The families of political opponents suffered especially terrible fates that reveal just how thoroughly Saddam had weaponized human relationships. Those who managed to flee Iraq and speak out against the regime from exile knew they had signed death warrants for relatives left behind. Saddam's security forces would arrest entire families, using them as leverage against exiled dissidents. Brothers, sisters, parents, elderly grandparents, and children as young as infants were imprisoned, tortured, and often executed. Their bodies were sometimes returned to surviving family members with mockingly inflated bills for the bullets used in the execution, a final insult that transformed grief into rage, but rage that had nowhere to go except inward. This practice served multiple purposes simultaneously. It punished opposition by making dissidents suffer even in exile, knowing what was happening to their families. It deterred others from defecting or speaking out. It demonstrated the regime's reach and ruthlessness. It created a culture where no one could trust anyone because even family members might be used as weapons against you. Religious leaders posed a particular challenge to Saddam's secular Ba'athist ideology. While he publicly claimed to respect Islam and even portrayed himself as a defender of Islamic values, when politically convenient, any religious figure who attracted a significant following or dared to criticize the regime became a target for elimination. Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr was one such figure, a respected Shia cleric whose Friday sermons drew thousands of followers. Al-Sadr eventually began criticizing the regime's policies and calling for Islamic governance, carefully but clearly challenging Saddam's authority. In February 1999, gunmen assassinated al-Sadr and two of his sons as they drove through Najaf after Friday prayers. The vehicles were riddled with bullets in broad daylight on a busy street. The regime claimed ignorance and suggested unknown militants were responsible, but no one doubted who had ordered the killing. Similar fates befell other religious leaders who refused to become mere instruments of state propaganda. Some were arrested and disappeared into the prison system, never to be seen again. Others were found dead in apparent accidents or suicide that fooled no one. The message was unmistakable. Religious authority was acceptable only when subordinate to political authority. Any challenge would be eliminated with extreme prejudice. But the regime's brutality reached its most horrific expression in its treatment of Iraq's Kurdish population, a campaign of systematic extermination that would eventually be legally defined as genocide. The Kurds, an ethnic minority concentrated in northern Iraq, had long sought autonomy or independence, viewing themselves as a distinct people with their own language, culture, and national aspirations. During the Iran-Iraq War, some Kurdish groups allied with Iran, viewing the conflict as an opportunity to advance their own goals. Saddam considered this the ultimate betrayal, an act of treason that demanded the most severe punishment imaginable. What followed was not military action against combatants, but a campaign of extermination against the Kurdish people as a whole. Between 1986 and 1989, the Iraqi military conducted the Anfal Campaign, a series of military operations against Kurdish civilians that would result in the deaths of an estimated 182,000 people, though the true number may never be known because entire villages simply ceased to exist, erased from the landscape through industrial-scale murder. The Anfal campaign was overseen by Ali Hassan al-Majid, Saddam's cousin, who earned the nickname Chemical Ali for his enthusiastic use of chemical weapons against civilian populations. The campaign followed a systematic pattern repeated in village after village across Kurdistan. Iraqi forces would surround a community, separate men and teenage boys from women and children, load the males onto trucks, and transport them to remote locations where they were machine-gunned and bulldozed into mass graves. The women, children, and elderly were forcibly relocated to government-controlled camps where conditions were deliberately harsh, with inadequate food, water, and medical care. Thousands of Kurdish villages were completely destroyed, their buildings demolished, their fields poisoned, their orchards burned. The goal was not just to defeat Kurdish resistance, but to eliminate Kurdish existence, to make the land itself uninhabitable, so that even if survivors returned, they would find nothing but devastation. But the single most horrific incident of the Anfal Campaign, the act that would come to symbolize Saddam's willingness to use weapons of mass destruction against his own citizens, was the attack on Halabja. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft began a chemical weapons attack on this Kurdish town near the Iranian border. Over the course of several hours, Iraqi forces dropped a cocktail of chemical agents, including mustard gas, sarin, tabun, and VX nerve agent on the civilian population below. Halabja descended into hell in a matter of minutes. The chemical agents, which included some of the most lethal substances ever developed for warfare, spread through the town like an invisible plague. People died in the streets, in their homes, in the shelters where they had sought refuge from conventional bombing. Parents died, shielding children who died anyway. Families, huddled together, were killed in moments, frozen in their final embrace. The poison was indiscriminate and merciless. Photographs from the aftermath, images that would eventually reach international media and shock the world, show bodies frozen in their final moments. A mother clutching a baby, both dead, the mother's body curved protectively over the infant, as if she might still save her child even in death. Families lying together in doorways where they fell while trying to escape. Individuals collapsed mid-stride, their bodies contorted in the agony of nerve agent poisoning. Approximately 5,000 people died in Halabja that day, with thousands more suffering injuries that would plague them for decades, causing cancers, respiratory diseases, blindness, and birth defects in the next generation. Survivors who lived through the Halabja attack describe the chaos in voices that still shake with remembered terror. They speak of the chemical smell that some compared to sweet apples, a deceptively pleasant odor that heralded death. They describe the burning sensation in their eyes and throats, the panic as they realized they were being gassed and there was nowhere to run, no shelter that could protect them from poison that permeated the air itself. Many went blind within minutes, stumbling through streets filled with the dying and the dead, unable to see but hearing the screams of their neighbors and family members. Others suffered respiratory damage so severe that they struggled to breathe, gasping for air that no longer sustained life, but instead poisoned them with every inhalation. Those who survived but lost entire families describe a guilt that haunts them still, a wondering why they lived when so many died, especially the children who had no chance to even understand what was happening to them. Yet the international response to Halabja was shockingly muted, revealing the moral bankruptcy of geopolitical calculation. The United States initially blamed Iran for the attack despite clear evidence of Iraqi responsibility. The reason was simple. Iraq was seen as useful against Iran, so atrocities could be minimized or ignored. This failure to condemn Saddam's use of chemical weapons against civilians sent a message that he interpreted clearly. The international community would not stop him. He could do anything. Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, deserve special attention in any accounting of the regime's brutality because they represented the next generation of terror, the heirs to a kingdom built on bones. Both were raised in an atmosphere of absolute power, where no desire was denied and no action faced consequences. Qusay, the younger son, was cold and methodical. Eventually placed in charge of the Special Republican Guard and the Mukhabarat, he implemented his father's policies with bureaucratic efficiency, overseeing torture facilities and directing security operations with the same emotional detachment one might apply to managing a business. He was dangerous precisely because he was rational, calculating, capable of ordering mass murder without passion or remorse. But Uday, the elder son and originally Saddam's heir, apparent, was something else entirely. He was a sadistic psychopath whose cruelty shocked even those accustomed to the regime's brutality, a man whose personal depravity became legendary throughout Iraq, and whose actions finally went too far even for his father. Uday Hussein's reign of personal terror was capricious and monstrous in ways that exceeded official state brutality. He frequented parties and nightclubs where he would select women who caught his eye, pointing them out to his bodyguards, who would then bring them to him. Refusal was not an option. Women who resisted were raped, sometimes tortured with cigarettes or other implements, occasionally killed if they fought too hard, or if Uday simply tired of them. Families of his victims lived in terror, knowing that any attempt to seek justice or even speak about what had happened would result in their own elimination. In 1988, Uday murdered his father's personal valet at a party, bludgeoning the man to death with a cane in front of horrified guests because he blamed the man for introducing Saddam to a new wife. Even Saddam recognized that this was too much, that Uday's behavior was spiraling out of control. He temporarily exiled Uday to Switzerland as punishment, but the exile lasted only months before Saddam called his son back, and Uday's behavior continued essentially unchecked. Uday also controlled Iraqi sports as head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, transforming athletics into another realm of terror. Athletes who failed to meet expectations faced torture as punishment for their failure. Soccer players who lost important matches were beaten on the soles of their feet with canes, a punishment called falaka that caused excruciating pain and often permanent damage. Some were imprisoned in shipping containers in the desert heat. Others were forced to kick concrete balls until their feet were destroyed. Uday maintained a private torture facility where he personally participated in interrogations and punishments, not out of any intelligence gathering necessity, but purely for his own sadistic enjoyment. He would force parents to watch as he tortured their children, or compel individuals to harm their own family members, finding pleasure in destroying human bonds and breaking spirits. Tales of his cruelty spread throughout Iraq, adding another layer of terror to an already terrified population. Even regime loyalists feared Uday because his violence was unpredictable. His rage could be triggered by anything, and his power protected him from any consequences. The regime's brutality extended even to Iraq's environment and cultural heritage in ways that revealed the totalizing nature of Saddam's cruelty. In southern Iraq, the Marsh Arabs, known as the Madan people, had lived in the vast marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for thousands of years, maintaining a unique culture adapted to the wetlands. After the 1991 Gulf War, when Shia rebels launched an uprising against Saddam's regime, many fled to the marshes where the geography made it difficult for government forces to pursue them effectively. Saddam's response was characteristically brutal, but also shocking in its scope. He would drain the marshes entirely, destroying both the landscape and the people who lived there, committing ethnic cleansing combined with environmental destruction on an unprecedented scale. Iraqi engineers working on Saddam's orders diverted rivers, built dams, and dug massive canals to drain the marshlands that had existed for millennia. What had once been 20,000 square kilometers of wetlands, one of the world's largest marsh systems, and a crucial ecosystem, shrank to less than 1,500 square kilometers within a decade. The ecological devastation was catastrophic, with countless species of birds, fish, and other wildlife losing their habitats, some being driven to extinction. But the human cost was even more severe and deliberate. The Madan people lost their homes, their way of life, and often their lives as villages were burned. Populations were forcibly relocated to government controlled areas, and those who resisted were killed. The regime used chemical weapons in some areas of the marshes to drive out holdouts, and death squads hunted refugees who tried to hide in the shrinking wetlands. Perhaps 200,000 Marsh Arabs were killed or displaced, their ancient culture brought to the edge of extinction. What made this particularly shocking was its combination of cultural genocide and environmental warfare. Saddam was not content to simply kill his enemies. He wanted to destroy the very landscape that had sheltered them, to make it impossible for their way of life to continue, even if survivors remained. The 1990 invasion of Kuwait revealed that Saddam's ambitions had not been tempered by the Iran-Iraq War's devastation. Iraq emerged from that conflict economically exhausted and heavily indebted, particularly to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had provided financial support. Saddam demanded that these debts be forgiven and that Kuwait reduce its oil production to allow prices to rise, essentially demanding that Kuwait pay for Iraq's war. When Kuwait refused, Saddam ordered an invasion that demonstrated his willingness to devour even fellow Arab nations in pursuit of power and wealth. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces swept into Kuwait, overwhelming the small nation's defenses within hours. What followed was an occupation marked by systematic brutality, torture, and theft on a massive scale that revealed the regime's character. Iraqi forces treated Kuwait as plunder, to be stripped of anything valuable. They looted museums and private homes. They stole cars, hospital equipment, industrial machinery, even traffic lights. Entire factories were disassembled and transported to Iraq. Kuwait's infrastructure was systematically vandalized and destroyed. Kuwaiti citizens who resisted faced imprisonment, torture, and execution in facilities that operated openly during the occupation. Iraqi intelligence services arrested and disappeared thousands of Kuwaitis, many of whom were never seen again. Torture centers operated where victims endured the same horrors perfected in Iraq's domestic prisons. Women were raped systematically as a weapon of terror, with Iraqi soldiers given implicit permission to assault Kuwaiti women as part of the occupation strategy of breaking the population's will. When Iraqi forces finally withdrew in February 1991, driven out by a US-led coalition in a military campaign that lasted only weeks, they committed one final act of spite and environmental terrorism. On Saddam's orders, retreating troops set fire to Kuwait's oil fields, igniting over 700 wells that created an environmental catastrophe. The fires darkened the skies for months, created oil lakes that poisoned the land, and demonstrated Saddam's willingness to destroy what he could not keep. If he could not have Kuwait's oil wealth, no one would. The Gulf War's aftermath brought new suffering to Iraq's people in ways that revealed how Saddam's regime prioritized its own survival over every other consideration. The military defeat was swift and devastating, with coalition forces destroying much of Iraq's military infrastructure. Encouraged by President George H.W. Bush's calls for Iraqis to rise up against Saddam, Shia communities in the south and Kurdish groups in the north launched rebellions, believing they would receive American support. But that support never materialized, and Saddam's remaining forces, particularly the Republican Guard that had been held back from Kuwait, crushed these uprisings with characteristic brutality that may have been even more savage because the regime had been humiliated by its defeat. Thousands were executed, often in public squares, as warnings to others. Helicopter gunships strafed civilian areas where rebels had taken control. Artillery pounded rebel-held cities with complete disregard for civilian casualties. The international community watched as Saddam massacred his own people, the same people they had just encouraged to rebel, but chose not to intervene because the political will to continue the war did not exist. The subsequent international sanctions imposed on Iraq, ostensibly to pressure Saddam into compliance with UN resolutions, became another instrument of suffering. Sanctions are blunt instruments that rarely harm the regimes they target, but devastate ordinary populations. In Iraq, while Saddam and his elite continued to live in obscene luxury, malnutrition rates soared among the general population. Child mortality increased dramatically, and Iraq's once excellent healthcare system collapsed. Medicine became scarce, water treatment facilities broke down, and diseases that had been under control reemerged. Some estimates suggest that 500,000 children died as a result of sanctions-related deprivation. Saddam's regime skillfully used this suffering for propaganda purposes, blaming the West while simultaneously hoarding resources for itself and allowing its own people to starve to maintain international sympathy. Even as Iraq's general population suffered, Saddam and his inner circle lived in obscene luxury that mocked the deprivation surrounding them. He maintained dozens of palaces across the country, each more opulent than the last, filled with gold fixtures and Italian marble, while Iraqi children died from easily preventable diseases. His sons lived like feudal lords, taking whatever they wanted with complete impunity. The corruption was systemic and shameless. Saddam's relatives and tribal allies from Tikrit controlled the economy's commanding heights, enriching themselves through oil smuggling and sanctions busting while the country crumbled. The regime's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and brutality as Saddam saw conspiracies everywhere and responded with purges that claimed even loyalists who had served him for decades. In 1995, his own sons-in-law, Hussein Camel and Saddam Camel, defected to Jordan, providing intelligence about Iraq's weapons programs to Western governments. Saddam lured them back to Iraq with promises of forgiveness, guarantees that they would not be harmed if they returned. They believed him, perhaps out of desperation or homesickness or inability to imagine that Saddam would murder his own daughter's husbands. Within days of their return, they and their father were killed, murdered by other family members on Saddam's orders. The message was unmistakable. No one was safe. No relationship was sacred. Loyalty meant nothing if Saddam perceived disloyalty. Even blood ties offered no protection. Public executions became routine spectacles designed to maintain control through visible terror. Bodies of executed prisoners were displayed publicly, hung from lampposts or left in squares, for days as warnings. Families of the executed were forbidden from mourning publicly because expressions of grief might be interpreted as criticism of the regime. Video recordings of torture sessions and executions were maintained both as records and as tools of intimidation. Some tapes were shown to prisoners to break their spirits before interrogation, letting them see what awaited them if they did not cooperate. Others were circulated among security personnel to normalize brutality and demonstrate the consequences of insufficient zeal in pursuing enemies. The regime maintained elaborate systems for tracking and controlling the population. Every Iraqi carried an identity booklet that recorded their sect, tribe, and political reliability. Changing residence required official permission. Professional advancement depended on Ba'ath Party membership, which in turn required demonstrated loyalty, often proven by participating in regime violence. This system created a society where everyone was complicit to some degree, either as perpetrator, victim, or silent witness, and where resistance seemed impossible because the regime had eyes everywhere and responded to threats with overwhelming brutality. The invasion of Iraq by U.S. and coalition forces in March 2003 brought Saddam's rule to an end in a military campaign that was swift, but whose consequences would reverberate for decades. Baghdad fell in April, but Saddam evaded capture for months, finally being found hiding in a concealed hole near his hometown of Tikrit in December 2003. His capture was anticlimactic in a way that seemed to mock his decades of projected strength. The dictator who had terrorized millions was discovered in a cramped underground hideout, disheveled and disoriented, looking less like a powerful leader than a hunted animal. Yet even in captivity, he attempted to maintain his dignity and refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, portraying himself as a patriotic leader betrayed by foreign powers rather than a tyrant who had brutalized his own people. Saddam Hussein stood trial before an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in the Ghraib Massacre, where 148 Shia men and boys were executed in retaliation for an assassination attempt. The trial was contentious, marked by Saddam's defiance and disruptions as he used the courtroom as a stage, ranting about American imperialism and refusing to recognize the court's legitimacy. The trial revealed details of regime atrocities through testimony from survivors who described what had been done to their communities, but was also criticized for procedural irregularities and the sense that the verdict was predetermined. Nevertheless, on November 5, 2006, Saddam was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Appeals were rejected, and the sentence was carried out on December 30th, 2006 during the Islamic festival of Eid al-Adha. The execution itself became controversial when unauthorized mobile phone footage of the hanging was leaked and widely distributed on the internet. The video showed Saddam being taunted by observers chanting sectarian slogans as he stood on the gallows with a noose around his neck. He maintained composure, refusing to show fear, and died reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. The leaked footage provoked international criticism, with many arguing that the execution had been conducted unprofessionally, and that the taunting violated the dignity supposedly accorded even to condemned prisoners. The chaotic manner of his death seemed a fitting end to a life and career defined by violence and chaos, a final moment of brutality in a story built entirely on brutality. Saddam Hussein's legacy is measured in mass graves that are still being excavated in scarred landscapes that will take generations to heal, in shattered communities that lost entire generations, and in traumatized populations that carry the psychological scars of his reign. Forensic teams have identified dozens of mass grave sites across Iraq containing the remains of hundreds of thousands of victims. The full extent of deaths attributed to his regime remains unknown, but certainly exceeds 500,000, with some estimates running into the millions when the Iran-Iraq war casualties are included. His rule left Iraq fractured along sectarian and ethnic lines that his regime had deliberately exploited and exacerbated, its economy destroyed, its infrastructure in ruins, and its people deeply traumatized in ways that affect Iraqi society to this day. The invasion that toppled him unleashed chaos and violence that claimed hundreds of thousands more lives in the years that followed, demonstrating that removing a dictator does not automatically restore the social fabric he spent decades tearing apart. The brutality of Saddam Hussein, his regime, stands as one of the starkest reminders in modern history of what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of an individual without conscience or accountability. His rise demonstrated how political movements founded on ostensibly noble principles like Arab unity, anti-imperialism, and social progress can be corrupted when hijacked by ruthless opportunists who use ideology cynically while pursuing naked self-interest. His rule showed how entire state apparatuses can be converted into instruments of terror, how societies can be atomized through fear until neighbor suspects neighbor and children inform on parents, and how brutality can become normalized and bureaucratized until torture and murder are simply administrative functions carried out by ordinary people who punch time clocks and go home to their families after a day of inflicting suffering. What makes Saddam's story particularly disturbing is that the men who staffed his torture centers and execution squads, who drained the marshes and gassed the villages, who separated families and buried bodies in mass graves, were not all psychopaths or sadists. Most were ordinary people who committed extraordinary evil because the system rewarded brutality and punished mercy, because refusing orders meant joining the victims, because after the first atrocity, the next became easier and eventually routine. This reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature and about how systems of terror function. They require not just monstrous leaders, but complicit populations, not just evil intentions, but bureaucratic structures that normalize horror, not just victims, but perpetrators who convince themselves that they are following orders or serving a higher purpose, or simply doing what must be done to survive. The story of Saddam Hussein resonates because it illustrates timeless truths about power, fear, and the human capacity for cruelty. It shows how dictators create and maintain control through calculated brutality that is both systematic and spectacular, both hidden in secret prisons and displayed in public executions. It demonstrates how they exploit tribal and sectarian divisions, turning communities against each other so that horizontal solidarity becomes impossible. and everyone looks to the leader for protection from their neighbors. It reveals how they use ideology cynically, wrapping naked self-interest in the language of nationalism or socialism or religious values, depending on what serves their purposes at any given moment. For the Iraqi people, the trauma of Saddam's reign continues to shape their country and their lives in ways that will persist for generations. Those who survived his torture centers carry physical and psychological scars that never fully heal. Families still search for relatives who disappeared decades ago, hoping for closure that may never come, but unable to stop searching. Children born under sanctions and war have known nothing but instability and violence. The sectarian violence that exploded after 2003 partly stems from grievances accumulated during Saddam's rule, when the Sunni minority dominated and the Shia majority was systematically oppressed. The Kurdish autonomous region exists partly as a response to the genocide attempted against them, a determination that never again will they be defenseless against such attacks. Every aspect of contemporary Iraqi society bears the marks of those brutal decades, and healing will be a multi-generational process. Saddam Hussein believed himself destined for greatness, a leader who would restore Arab power and pride, who would unite the Arab world under his leadership, who would be remembered as a historic figure comparable to ancient conquerors. Instead, he became a byword for tyranny, his name synonymous with brutality and megalomania. The palaces he built at enormous expense while his people starved are now empty monuments to vanity. The statues erected in his honor, which once stood in every city, showing him in various heroic poses, have been torn down and destroyed. The personality cult he cultivated through controlled media and enforced displays of loyalty has been exposed as hollow propaganda that convinced no one who was not compelled to pretend belief. What remains is the suffering he caused, the murdered whose bodies fill mass graves, the tortured whose scars, physical and psychological, will never fade, the displaced who lost homes and communities and ways of life, the poisoned whose genetic damage will affect generations yet unborn. His reign transformed Iraq from a prosperous nation with significant potential and an educated population into a cautionary tale about unchecked power, a warning about what happens when international systems fail to constrain tyrants, a reminder that evil is not an abstraction but manifests in concrete acts of cruelty committed by human beings against other human beings. As the years pass and survivors age, the danger of forgetting looms, and with it, the danger of repeating the patterns that allowed Saddam's reign of terror to continue for nearly 25 years. Already, some attempt to rehabilitate his image, emphasizing the stability and prosperity of Iraq's early Ba'athist period while minimizing or ignoring the systematic terror. This revisionism dishonors the dead, insults the survivors, and makes future atrocities more likely by suggesting that brutality can be acceptable if accompanied by economic development or national strength. The mass graves scattered across Iraq demand remembrance. The testimony of survivors requires bearing witness. The children who grew up in fear deserve their stories told. History's judgment on Saddam Hussein must remain unambiguous. He was a tyrant whose brutality scarred a nation and whose crimes against humanity place him among the 20th century's worst mass murderers. That judgment must not be softened by time or political expedience, or the human tendency to remember the past through rose colored glasses. The full accounting of Saddam Hussein's brutality may never be complete. Mass graves remain undiscovered in remote areas. Documents were destroyed as the regime fell. Witnesses have died, and some secrets were carried to graves. But what we do know, documented in court proceedings and survivor testimony and forensic evidence, is sufficient. The chemical weapons attacks that killed thousands, the industrial scale torture that broke bodies and spirits, the ethnic cleansing that eliminated entire communities, the casual cruelty of a regime that valued power above all else. This is Saddam Hussein's legacy, and this is what we must remember.